It's time if you'd like to start.
Sure. Since we are at 9:30 and it looks like we have a quorum, I would like to call this meeting to order. Do we need to do a roll call? Yeah.
Good morning. Please signify your attendance for the record by saying here. Kevin Bartram,
Here.
Justin Schoenberg,
Here.
Brian Berg,
Here.
Dave Obermiller,
Here.
Mike Wild,
Here.
and it's been noted that Chairman Dietrich is absent.
At this time, do we want to do a reading or an approval of the past meeting minutes?
Yes,
Are there any corrections we need to discuss for those meeting minutes?
not unless you found any in the record.
If there are no corrections, I assume or would say that the minutes stand approved.
Motion to approve. You need to call for motion.
At this time, can we get a motion to approve the meeting minutes?
I'd like to make a motion to approve the meeting minutes from the last meeting.
And can we get a second?
Second.
Meeting minutes are approved. And as we move forward, do we need reports from officers?
Next on is unfinished business, and that's agenda item we put on there for review of the bylaws. We did that last annual meeting also, and a couple of issues have come up since then. And what we'd like you to do is address the annual meeting, because I think the annual meeting came up around the holiday last time, and we had an issue with getting people to attend. So I believe in your packet, you'll see two recommendations for an annual meeting time. And what we thought the best was, since the recommended motion, if you see that in a memo to you, will be to select an alternative month other than July to hold the annual meeting, and direct the board secretary to update the text of the bylaws to reflect the said month. And if you'll do that, then next meeting we'll read that again and approve it. So this motion is preferred to limit scheduling conflicts. Gretchen has to pre-schedule this room, and it gets a little tight sometimes. So what we'd like to do is change it back to August so that it doesn't conflict with the holiday ever. And we already have that scheduled. So all we're going to do is move it back 1 month to hold the annual meeting. And the alternative is to actually pick a different day in July, which then we have to go back to administration and check those dates to make sure they work. And it's just off the regular scheduled meeting. So we would like you to motion and approve the recommended motion.
So the motion on the table is to move the annual meeting to August. Do we have a specific day in August that we're targeting?
Our meetings are scheduled for the first Thursday of every month at 9:30. So it would be just changing that wording in the bylaws from July to August.
Okay.
I'll make the motion to change the language to change the date of the annual meeting from the first Thursday of July to the first Thursday of August.
I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Say aye.
Aye.
Okay. Motion approved to move the annual meeting to August. Is that the end of the unfinished business, Bruce?
Yes.
Okay. Now we'll move on to new business.
So we have an appeal today. It doesn't happen very often, so this is a good appeal. I'll start out by saying the project is at 412 Fifth Avenue North, and I'm Bruce Tarles from the Inspection Department. I am the building official but the code also allows building officials to have deputies. So there's other people here from the code department that actually enforce the code. Whenever they are enforcing the code, or the plan reviewers, such as Doug, who did this project, they have, in essence, the same authority as the building official when they're acting in that capacity. So you're going to see that along the way. A little bit about the appeal. Like I say, you can stop us, both myself and the appellant, anytime and ask questions that you want. Just get our attention. And I'll tell you a little refresher on what the inspections does. We accept applications and plans for permits. We review those plans, and that's in essence what an appeal is on today. Doug has reviewed a project, and there's one item that is on appeal today, and we'll go into that in a little bit. After the reviewed plans are approved, we write the permits, and then we inspect for compliance. And I'd like to say that all of that ends out in providing safe buildings for the public. And I did want to mention that inspections duties are not to any one owner. Everything that we do is for the general public. You can see that buildings usually aren't for one person. They're for lots of people to go in and use. And so that's why everything we do is for the general public and not specific to one project or one building. When we're reviewing and approving, we're looking at what the designers have submitted to us and reviewing that for the code, not necessarily for one specific project or the owner. This case, I'll present inspections point of view, and the appellant will express their point of view. And then you can deliberate. Hopefully you can decide on a motion. I wanted to say that this case does appear complicated. We put a lot of information on paper. The appellant has, you received that, you received mine, and there's a lot on there. I'm going to try and summarize, and I'm going to skip some, and we might end up going back to it, so don't worry about it. If it's skipped, you can bring it up if you like. The fact is, the underlying issue is rather simple in our eyes. It is whether the walls that the appellant wants to construct are to be a fire barrier rated wall or not. That's the issue in the end. And how we get to that point when we review it in the code. I did want to mention that this case is new. There's a lot of open parking garages around Fargo, the state, the world, and there's a lot of enclosed parking garages. There's a lot of private garages. This is the first time we've seen somebody want to put private garages inside a parking garage. You can even see that when you see some of the answers from the ICC personnel that both we and the appellant have inquired of in their responses. It's new. You even can tell by his answers. So it's complicated, but it's really simple, one decision. And in the end, you're either going to agree with our interpretation or the appellant's. So I'm going to start out by just reviewing the project. The 412 Fifth Avenue North. It's in the downtown area, just off of Broadway, right in this location right here. The project is townhouses. And the actual garages will be constructed inside an existing parking garage. The project is between 4th and 5th Avenue, just off of Broadway. If you've been downtown lately, you'll see it. It's commonly called the Mercantile Project. Here's the large map with the background. And we're right in here. And then I'm going to blow it up and even more so you can see 412 is where the townhouses will be constructed. 410 is the parking garage. I'll show you a picture of that soon. The Mercantile Project actually surrounds the outline of the 401 to 527 lot, and the complete front of 410, the south portion. I'll show you pictures of that. One of the issues that came up on this project, or some of them, this is a very complex project. There's multiple properties, multiple owners of multiple properties. The city of Fargo is involved in the parking ramp itself. And then there's property line issues with the multiple buildings. Here is some pictures I found of open parking garages, and they're common. I just grabbed them, put them up here. Open parking garages, they're very specific to how they're constructed. And mostly, an open parking garage, the biggest requirement is that it's open. There's requirements for how much open, what percentage, how many sides, everything. But the openness requirement allows it to be not sprinklered. That's the biggest issue with the open parking garage. There's other open parking garages, such as these. You might see that they might look enclosed, but they're actually not. The designer has figured out how to keep it open and still make it look like it's enclosed. And here's a couple of pictures of some enclosed parking garages. This one's enclosed. Both of them are enclosed with glass, but they're still enclosed, and they will be fully sprinklered. The current project, this is a picture of rendering from the architect showing the townhouses. We're looking on the north side to the south, and you can see the upper area is the parking garage to the south. This is JLG Architects rendering of the Mercantile project. Mixed use project directly to the south of the townhomes over here, and full residential and mixed use to the south and the west. And the private garages will go into this parking ramp pretty much over in this location. I went out and took an actual picture, and the building looks almost exactly like the rendering. You can see down here in the corner a plywooded opening. That is one of the openings to the private garages. Here's a engineered plan showing the open parking garage again, future townhomes, entrance to the ramp, exit, mixed use over on the other side. Larger area of the parking ramp. Took some actual pictures of the ramp. Here's the openings to the private garages. And there's a large picture of those openings. So each private garage will get its own opening into its own garage. Here's the architect's plan of the townhomes and how they're attached to the parking garage. You can see there's, I think there's three. No, there's two on the top level, but 3 parking garages inside the open parking garage. On the main level, 4 units. There's another garage outside. Level 2 with 3 garages, and the 3rd floor with 2 garages. So the issue we have is these walls for these private parking garages, and if they are fire rated, resistant rated, or not. I have a lot of code on here, and I'm going to skip a bunch of it. I'm going to read some of the important sections pertain to how we feel in the inspection department. IBC 102.1 general, where there is a conflict between a general requirement and a specific requirement, the specific requirement shall be applicable. Shall means it will be. It's a legal term. Where in any specific case, different sections of this code specify different materials necessary for construction. Duties and powers of the building official or the inspections department or the building official hereby authorized and directed to enforce the code. The building official shall have the authority to render interpretations of this code. That means that myself, or the inspection department, the plan bureau, the inspector, can interpret the code. Nobody else interprets the code. We are the final authority, not the ICC, not the architect, not the appellant. It's us. We interpret the code. So what you're going to do here today is decide that we did not interpret correctly. You won't interpret, just that we didn't interpret it correctly. Read it correctly, enforce sections correctly, or somehow get to that point. The section on limits on authority. An application for appeal should be based on the claim that the true intent of this code or the rules legally adopted thereof have been incorrectly interpreted. That's what I just mentioned. The provisions do not fully apply, or equally better form of construction is proposed. We've had a lot of discussion on this topic with the owner about different ways to do it. The board shall not have authority to waive the requirements of the code. I put a lot in here on open parking garages, a little bit on enclosed, but really an open parking garage is that it's open, and the openness requirements allow it to be non-sprinkler. A little of this is going to go in order how Doug probably does his plan review. Section 3, we classify the building, and we get into that. I highlighted the two sections that the architect designer had in his code analysis. He said S2, open parking garage, not sprinklered, and group U for the private garages. 302 doesn't even mention certain uses require specific limitations and controls in accordance with the provisions of Chapter 4 and elsewhere in the code. That even gives us a clue. We can't just do this. We can't look at Chapter 7, 9, 1, 2. We got to go to 4. And I'll explain a little bit about Chapter 4, which is different. Here's S2, old parking garages, Group U utility, the private garage part of Group U. Here's a snippet from the architect's code analysis for the project, and I'm just going to bring up this one right here. 406.3. The architect writes, classification, private garages shall be classified as Group U. Each private garage shall be no greater than 1,000 square feet. Multiple private garages shall be separated by 1 hour fire barrier. It's our interpretation by that section that these garages need to be separated. And there are other issues of separation in here that the architect brings out, and we're not going to bring those up because they're not really pertinent. He called out non-separated uses. So we get into Chapter 4, which starts out detailed occupancy and use requirements. In addition to occupancy and construction requirements in this code, the provisions of this chapter apply to occupancies and uses described therein. And Chapter 4 is special. You don't always have to go to 4, but you have to review it to see if there's anything in there that pertains to your project. In this case, it's motor vehicle related occupancies. And I'm going to go right down to 406.3.1. Private garages and carports shall be classified as Group U occupancies. That's an agreement with the architect. Each private garage shall be not greater than 1,000 square feet in area. Multiple private garages are permitted in the building where each private garage is separated from the other private garages by 1 hour fire barriers in accordance with 707 or 1 hour horizontal assemblies. And our interpretation of that section is that these garages need separation. You can relate it to apartment type garages. Those are separated into 1,000 square foot sections. So if you have a long strip that's 9,000 square feet, you're going to have 9 1,000 private garages in that building separated by fire barriers. So we're using that same criteria on these private garages.
Bruce, I have a question. Is it?
Yep.
Is the separation requirement between the group U occupancies, or is the separation requirement around the entire perimeter of the group U occupancies? Because that seems like, I mean, the language here seems like it's saying each private garage should be separated from other private garages by 1 hour fire barriers. It
is confusing because you're gonna kind of go back into separations.
right,
In that private, that's why I call it that private strip. It's clear in that strip, you're gonna have 1,000 square foot separations from the other ones. Now, if I look at it like there's a lot of things going on in that building. First of all, it's not sprinklered. Are we gonna allow somebody to put private garages that need separations in that S2 open parking garage? When does it not become an open parking garage? You're gonna allow them to have 8 of them? Or you're gonna allow them to have 20, 50? Why won't other people, there's other parking garages that are open in this town that have dedicated spots. You're gonna let them separate them and have nothing.
Sure.
I look at it like it's a private garage in that strip apartment building. 1,000 square feet. The code's telling us we don't want anything to burn but that 1,000 square feet if something should happen in that space. It's the same here. That's how we're thinking. The 1,000 square feet needs separation. You turn an open parking garage where private people are coming in and parking every day, they're coming and going. Are they expecting to have a stall next to them with a gas can in it? You're not putting gas cans in that open parking garage normally. It says, hey, this is new, it's different. You're gonna see an excerpt from, I consider one of the best code guys in the country, Doug Thornburg, who, in our eyes, our opinion, clearly states it. And
Yeah.
so it's where do you start and stop that wall you're talking
Right.
about? I mean, the appellant even brought it up. Well, we'll do it out to the edge. No, that's not enough. In our world, fire barriers don't stop. They have to get somewhere. They have to get to another fire,
Right.
wall, fire barrier, fire rate of something
kinda where I
before
was-
it can stop.
That's
So-
kind of where I was going with, my thought is, that it's clear that the designer intended to have 1 hour separation between the garages because their code report says that. But the question here is where that 1 hour separation stops, and it looks like it's on 3 sides right now. It's on the sides between, and it's on the back wall, because you have a concrete wall there.
on every wall except for the front. It can
Except
be,
for the
it'd
front,
be easy
so-
to do, yeah.
But
They
continuity is important.
I relate it to the strip, only that it is a clear separation and it's almost like a fire. It used to be a firewall separation. They changed it to a fire barrier, which made it easier to do in these cases. You wouldn't even be able to do the firewall. But in our world, fire rated construction doesn't stop out in the middle of nowhere. It always gets to some point to help. In that private strip garage, it gets to the exterior wall. It has a 180-degree wall. Fire's not supposed to go around corners. Maybe the fire department can help me with that. But it's different in those strip garages. All right, I'm gonna keep going. I put a lot in here about open parking garages only to show all the requirements for open parking garages. Open parking garages get allowances because they're open. And when this first came up, I couldn't see sticking private garages inside an open parking garage. I couldn't wrap my head around that. And in here, the area height and increase section allows you to have a much larger building because it's open, not enclosed. And that complicates that open-closed parking garage issue too, because they have done things to comply, to keep the compliance on the openness of the exterior wall. All we're talking about is inside the building. There's a lot of requirements on an open parking garage. These requirements, such as height areas, ventilation, sprinkler system, how will they affect what's going on with private garages, where you can do, I don't know, whatever you want in a private garage. You can store whatever you want. It's not a public parking garage, in our opinion. I'm going to skip 508. The architect did call non-separated, so in our eyes, you couldn't not ignore 406.3. Some we don't always do. We went to ICC for an opinion on this. Doug did a good job explaining the situation to Doug Thornburg at ICC. And Doug says, in my opinion, the appropriate provision to apply is 406.3, requiring basically a 1 hour separation between the group U garages and the S2, such there is no more than 1,000 square feet. That's all I need to read. Table 508 would only apply if separated out for chosen by the architect, and they were not. So I'll summarize and then yield the floor. I'll say if this appeal is approved, then like I said, how many private garages would you allow in an open parking garage? This project wants to construct 8. For our review and thinking, there are none that are not separated if just the separation walls between the private garages are allowed to be done. How many? In our opinion, we can't ignore 406.3, which is a specific chapter that would override all other code sections and clearly states private garages are separated. If this appeal is approved, we feel strongly it does create an unsafe condition in this public parking garage where you may even park. We strongly request the appeal be denied in the applicant in order to comply with the code per our interpretation. I'll yield the floor.
Good morning, members of the board. My name is Tom Smith. Today, I am here seeking a determination of this Board of Appeals that supports our position regarding the design of our development, the Great Northern Block. I am not here today to ask that you approve any sort of variance to code requirements specified in the 2018 IBC. I only ask that you carefully review our plans and compare them to the requirements and provisions of the 2018 IBC. We ask that you apply every written requirement, but apply none that are unwritten. I understand that such requests are fairly rare. This, I am sure, is due to the careful and accurate work performed by the local building officials. They have the task of reviewing and making determinations on hundreds of plans each year. I believe these determinations are made without bias and with their best attempt to apply the intent of the code in such a way that supports the development of properties within the city and ensures safe, accessible, and environmentally friendly spaces for all of us to live and work. Today, I respectfully appeal to this board to take a second look at just one of the many determinations this department has made in its review of our project. Our plans, as you are now aware, call for small garage units to be constructed within the open parking garage. I do want to make a couple of clarifications here. The project that we are developing are not townhomes. They are condominiums. These are not units that go from floor to ceiling, or I'm sorry, from basement to roof, foundation to roof. There are different dwelling units within different levels. And as such, the parking system that we have designed locates, let me get back on my track here, parking garage is located in an adjacent site to which we're developing. The plan provides condo owners with private garages within the ramp affording direct access to their homes at various stories above grade plane. As Bruce mentioned, there are many factors that have brought us to this one remaining issue. We've worked through all of those various factors, including, and very importantly, the requirements of the open parking garage. Our agreement with the city, who will soon become the owner of this parking garage, they will be we will be the tenants in this agreement, mandates that we do not do anything that affects the open nature of the parking garage, and largely because that open classification of the existing parking garage grants the existing structure the ability to be non-sprinklered. None of the things that we have proposed affect that. Careful consideration was made for what the ventilation requirements are on opposite ends of the building. Our parking garages are placed within the building, but even if they were pushed all the way to an exterior wall, they would not impact the openings required on any level of the parking garage. So we're not in any way affecting the open parking garage with this construction. Bruce asked how many more will happen. Well, we're asking for 3, not 8. We're asking I'm sorry, let me correct myself. We're asking for 4 spaces, not 8. But the how many more is limited by the open parking code in section 406.5. If more go in, eventually you wind up butting up against the open parking garage requirements. That is the code specified limitation to how many more. It's not an open question. We have one last step in our process, and that is to request this board to determine that our plans meet the separation requirements of IBC section 403.1 and section 508. One of the challenges in making this appeal is that our team's really not been provided with detail of the basis of the reviewer's determination. For months, the reviewer held that we were not achieving the requirements for separation between 2 of the occupancies as specified in footnote B of table 508.4. At this time, it seems, by Bruce's comments today and what he relayed to me late last week, that I believe the inspection department has dropped that portion of their claim. I received a notice from Bruce that they intended today to only assert that our plans do not meet the separation requirements set forth by section 406.3.1. Today, I intend to demonstrate that we do meet those requirements. I'm going to bounce through a couple of slides here because they are the information that Bruce provided to me in terms of what it was that he intended to present today. Now, if in fact the inspections department no longer intends to assert that footnote B for table 508.4 creates a separation requirement between group U and group S2 occupancies, I will not argue that aspect of our appeal today, but I would ask that this board does provide its determination in this matter by confirming that table 508.4 specifies no separation requirement between group U and group S2 occupancies, and that footnote B does not apply when there is not a required separation. Earlier, the reviewer had sought the guidance from Doug Thornburg. We've both referenced the information that Doug Thornburg has provided to us. He's a technical director at the ICC. In his response, the ICC official stated that in his opinion, footnote B would not apply in cases where the specification of table 508.4 is no separation required. He further described a method that if the designer should specify 508.4, not the table, but the section 508.4, separated occupancies, then there would be no separation required. I quote from his note, table 508.4 would only apply if separated occupancies were chosen by the architect. They have been chosen by the architect. And I do not believe footnote B applies when no separation is required. So I think this route would not require a separation. Later, the lead architect in our project reached out to the same ICC official for some guidance and understanding on why the official maintained his position on the code. Well, the official from the ICC was very careful to maintain that such determination was to be made at the local level, which includes this Board of Appeals. He stated again that his opinion aligns with ours. When presented with this information, the local officials disregarded the new information from the ICC, and furthermore, they refused to allow their staff to disseminate this information to this board. Today, I would like to present that information as the guidance from the ICC for your consideration. And I will demonstrate to you that in this narrow matter, the local building officials are in error and that their determination must be reversed. In addition to the letter from Mr. Thornburg, I plan to provide information I plan to present information that was recently provided to attendees of an online ICC seminar covering the use of mixed occupancies. This material was originally presented by a Jay Woodward on October 21st at the annual conference of the ICC in Las Vegas. With these ICC resources and direct reference to the 2018 IBC, I will demonstrate to this board that our plans comply with every separation called for in section 406.3.1. I will present the way in which section 508 clearly specifies the separation requirement, and as Doug already has asserted, I will assert as well that those specific requirements apply over more general requirements found elsewhere in the code. First, I'd like to go over the most recent guidance from the matter provided by the ICC official, Doug Thornburg. And in it, he says, and I apologize because this is displays quite small on the screen, and my eyes are now advanced in age, but he describes a situation that, or he says that the situation we described is quite unusual, and he thinks the primary disagreement is in the application of footnote B of table 508.4. As I have indicated, my personal opinion is that the footnote would not apply where the table permits no separation between the different occupancies. He continues, the code text can certainly be viewed differently, and since this is an interpretation of the code's intent, its application lies solely with the building official, and I'll remind you again, with this board. Based on the language of section 406.3.2, the following section, the separation of the private garages from public parking garages is based on section 508. So the interpretation of 508.4 is key to applying any fire separation. Since 406.3.1 only requires a separation of private garages from each other, it's an entirely different issue. The code does not specifically state the extent of any required 1 hour separation. Again, he acknowledges that this is a matter for interpretation, but he goes on to say, when applying table 508, the separations, would be limited to the common walls, but 508 is not referenced here. However, 508 is part of the 2018 IBC. It's a specific requirement of the 2018 IBC, which we believe shall be applied over the more general requirements stated in 406.3.1. Now, at this time, I'd like to pass over any additional information that I prepared regarding footnote B of 508.4. As we understand, the building official is no longer asserting that there is a separation requirement between Group U and Group S2 occupancies. However, if later in these proceedings, the building official does renew this assertion, I'd expect to have an opportunity to rebut such an assertion. So let's look to section 406. Were it not for the special detailed requirements of Chapter 4 relating to motor vehicle occupancies, this is much as Bruce has stated for you, these garages would simply be accessory occupancies under the provisions of 508.2, but they're not. They are motor vehicle related occupancies, so we drop into Chapter 4, Section 406. The relevant sections I've included here in their entirety. First, we have the definition, what is a private garage? It's pretty clear that what we're proposing here is a private garage. 406.3 further defines the private garages and specifies that they shall comply with sections 406.2 and 406.3, or they shall comply with 406.2 and 406.4. 406.2 covers standards for all motor vehicle related occupancies. 406.3 is specific to private garages, and 406.4 specifies a slightly more restrictive set required for public parking garages, both open and enclosed. We have specified that our plan will adhere to sections 406.2 and 406.3. The classifications of 406.3, this has been read before. Private garages and carports shall be classified as Group U occupancies. Each private garage shall be not greater than 1,000 square feet in area. Multiple private garages are permitted in a building where each private garage is separated from the other private garages by 1 hour fire barriers in accordance with section 707, or 1 hour horizontal assemblies in accordance with section 711, or both. The next section, entitled Separation, provides additional information on those separation requirements. For other than private garages adjacent to dwelling units, which ours are not in this case because of the fire wall and separate building between, the dwelling units are in a separate building on the other side of a fire wall. The separation of private garages from other occupancies shall comply with section 508. Finally, section 102 on applicability states that specific requirements are applicable over general requirements when there is a disagreement between the two. The reviewers have indicated that our plans do not meet the requirements, and they have required separations that are similar to fire area separations that are defined and established in Chapter 9. They assert that because the separation requirements of 406.3.1 are not specified, they are subject to interpretation. While we agree that the separation requirements of 406.3.1 are general in their definition, those found in the following section, 406.3.2, titled Separation, are not. And again, Chapter 1 directs us to look at the more specific requirements when compared to more general ones. The very specific provisions of 406.3.2 and by extension 508 shall apply. The code in this case is clear. We believe that the reviewer in our case has arrived at a determination in error by not applying the more specific requirements as the code states it shall be done. We do not debate the reviewer's commitment to safety or even his belief that the additional safety measures he has mandated could provide increased protections inside the structure. In fact, the separations we have proposed would already go beyond the code requirements. We are providing 1 hour separation between Group U areas, which are between only 20 and 45% of the maximum allowed in section 406.3.1. I am sure that with each new release of the IBC, the code developers rely on people like our local reviewer to establish new requirements and provisions. You too may believe that the reviewer's requirements could provide some benefit, but that is not the threshold to be applied here today. The code is clear. It's the very specific requirements of section 508 of the 2018 that shall be applied. Doug Thornburg says it in his letter to Doug. Doug Desatel, the local reviewer, and to our architect. And the presentation of mixed occupancies that the ICC official says, and section 102.1 says it. The specific application, the specific requirement must be applied. Let's take a moment. I'm going to go through this quickly for the sense of time, but let's take a moment to just jump into 508. And I'm just going to pull some slides from this recent online seminar about separations. This, again, was presented originally in person on October 21st, 2019 at the annual convention of the ICC in Las Vegas, Nevada. Talks about definition of mixed occupancies. I'll bounce through these fairly quickly, but I want to make it clear that we have selected 508.4, section 508.4, separated occupancies. I want to take a step back. This is government page G113 from the architects who designed and received approval for the existing structure, the open parking garage. In it, there is a call out of on section 406 that says mixed use shall be allowed in the same building where open parking garage, subject to the provisions under a variety of things, which includes section 508. So just taking a step back and making sure that the board is aware that mixed use or mixed occupancies are already approved within the existing parking garage. Again, back to this presentation. They discuss how 508 is very specific in its requirements, that they are required in some cases, that they're not required in others. Fire barriers are per 707, horizontal assemblies are per 711. We understand all those requirements. The 4 key components, the occupancy classification, the allowable height and areas of the buildings, and finally the separation, all of those must be achieved. It's important to note that the determination of the option depends on the designer. The designer selects whether or not the occupancy is to be determined as an accessory occupancy, an unseparated occupancy, or a separated occupancy. Again, we've selected separated occupancies, which drop us into section 508.4. the compliance with at least one of those three is to be verified by the building official. So again, separated occupancies, it bounces us back to table 508.4. We acknowledge that in section 406.3.1, there is a requirement not specified in table 508.4, but table 508.4 is very clear in the fact that there is no separation requirement between the Group U private garages and the adjacent S2 open parking garage space. An important section on 508.4.1, where occupancy separations also define the limits of any fire areas as established in Chapter 9 for requiring an automatic sprinkler system, additional provisions shall apply. It seems that this is a sort of separation that the reviewers are mandating. Our separations are not fire area separations. They're described later in Chapter 508. But I just want to dig into the fire area concept for a moment. 901.7 fire areas, where buildings or portions thereof are divided into fire areas so not to exceed the limits of established for requiring fire protection systems in accordance with this chapter, those fire areas shall be separated. And section 903 calls out for every single occupancy some sort of a requirement for how large those areas can be before they must be divided into smaller fire areas, which are fully enclosed, the type of enclosure that the reviewer seems to be asking for, or they need to be sprinkled. That's the gist of 903. Most of those area limitations are 12,000 square feet. Some are less, some have special exceptions, some have special requirements. Every single occupancy group has some specified limit except for Group U. Group U is clearly the lowest hazard risk of all the groups. The separation requirement of 406.3.1 are not meant to create a fire area within a Group U occupancy. The area limitation is far smaller than what exists for any of the other higher risk occupancies, and in fact, section 903 specifies that Group U occupancies are exempt from all fire area limitations. Interestingly, the only other occupancy in the building and adjacent to our Group U is the S2 open parking garage, which also enjoys unlimited area without requirement of fire separation system. That is to say, of all the occupancies, only Group U and the special condition of S2 open parking garage do not have area limits relating to fire protection systems. These occupancies are the least hazardous of all occupancies. I just want to wrap up what the presenter said in his Las Vegas piece. There are four elements, you remember, there in each separated occupancy determination. One is determining what the occupancies are. The other is, does it affect allowable area or allowable height? It does not. Our garage units are completely enclosed within the other open parking garage. But under section 508.4.4, the requirement for fire-resistant related separations between adjacent occupancies vary. The requirements are established in table 508.4, and in our case, remember this is a presentation about separated occupancies, not specific to ours, but in general, how to determine separated occupancies. Table 508.4 allows for some occupancy pairs to be adjacent with no fire, resistive, or physical separation. And again, if we pop back to the note from Doug Thornburg, he says, when applying table 508, those being the fire barrier separations, would be limited to common walls. But he goes on to say 508 is not referenced here. Again, this brings us back to the chapter 1 section where specifics outweigh general requirements. Again, the presenter in Las Vegas talks about determining the minimum fire resistance or equating between adjacent occupancies. Our position is the common wall separations that we have proposed between all of the much smaller than need to be Group U occupancies meet the requirements of 403.1. So our proposal, 1 hour fire barriers in horizontal assemblies separating all adjacent Group U private garages. Similar wall construction in non-separated areas such as the fronts of these garages. The fronts of the garages will have unprotected openings. I do want to just make a side note here. Bruce mentioned that because the other 3 sides are already bound in fire areas, that it would be easy to enclose the front areas, but that certainly is not the case. Ordinarily, like all of you have done in the past, we would work with the building officials to come up with a workaround, to come up with a plan, to come up with a way so that we can avoid having an appeal such as this. But in this particular case, the overhead clearances within the private parking garages do not permit any sort of fire protection in the openings in that wall. Now, I understand that hardship is in no way a reason to request variance. Again, I'm not requesting a variance. I'm only providing that information as a reason for why in the heck I would take it to this point. Why in the heck I would make an appeal rather than just work with the building officials to come up with a plan. And that reason is simple. What they request cannot be constructed because of the overhead clearances within the parking ramp. We also, as part of our proposal, will have reduced area of the Group U private garages to much, much smaller than what 406.3.1 allows. They'll only be between 200 and 430 square feet, 20 to 45% of the code limit. Our assertion is that the separation of private garage occupancies at 1,000 square feet does not constitute a fire area requiring complete enclosure. The specification of separation of adjacent occupancies refers to common walls only in the horizontal assemblies. Specific requirements shall apply over general requirements as stated in Chapter 1, and that footnote B of Table 508.4 does not apply when the table specifies no separation requirements. So the relief that we seek today is for this board to apply all relevant sections of the code, including Section 508.4, separated occupancies. For this board to find that our proposal complies with the requirements of 406.3.1, and for this board to find that our proposal complies with the requirements of 508.4 and footnote B. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Tom and Bruce, for your discussion topic. Very interesting and complicated.
And I will rebut. First, we'd like to applaud Mr. Tom Smith for his activity in the code, because we don't get this almost ever, especially with an owner. You would have paid big money for this training you got here today. And even the inspectors and the plan reviewers, they're listening and they're seeing how you can get caught up in the code loops, one section to the other, bouncing back and forth. So I'm going to explain a couple things on how we look at things. Fire barriers. There's no such thing as an unprotected opening in a fire barrier. None. They all have opening protectives. There's two architects. You know how that works. He talked about Chapter 9 and fire areas. Fire areas are only used in a sprinklered building. It has nothing to do with this building. They haven't proposed a sprinkler. You can throw all that out. He mentioned that he was using separated occupancies. I'll point back to the code sheet we received under Table 508, S2 to U, none. That tells us no separation, non-separated occupancies. But I'm still going to talk about 508. I wasn't going to, but I will. Table 508 does say S2 and U, similar occupancies in certain cases, not all. No separation requirement. I don't always do this, but I'm going to read from code commentary that gives us a little insight into how the people that wrote the code, they try and explain how they wrote it. Table 508.4, the purpose of 508.4 is to set forth the fire resistant rating required for fire barrier walls between and horizontally to separate occupancies. Fire resistance rating and separation is based on the table and the severity of the occupancies. N in this table represents a separation is not required between the uses because the hazards are the same. We're not saying that these hazards are the same. NP means where an occupancy is required to be sprinkled, so the non-sprinklered option they're not permitted. That's what NP means. S is for occupancies that are equipped throughout with a sprinkler system. Now they made a couple comments about the footnotes, and I'm going to read footnote that Mr. Smith references. The required separation from areas used only for private or pleasure vehicles shall be reduced by 1 hour, but not to less than 1 hour. He doesn't agree with our interpretation that the minimum is 1 hour. But I'm going to read the commentary on footnote B. The fire incident rating of spaces used solely for private or pleasure vehicles may be reduced by 1 hour, but never less than 1 hour. That's from the code guy who wrote the code.
Could you read that again, please, for me, that comment? Thank you.
It says, footnote B, the fire incident rating of spaces used solely for private or pleasure vehicles may be reduced by 1 hour, but never less than 1 hour. That is how we interpreted footnote B. We're not even going there. We're still going with 406.3 and the anticipated uses of the space. That's our case. We're saying this is different. Fire barriers need to stop somewhere. We don't want them just to stop here. We don't want people to drive into an inferno from a space that's open with an unprotected opening. The garage section gets very confusing. Mr. Smith went to 406. It starts out with private garages and it talks about the 1 hour separation. Under public parking garages, which is the building that he's putting those private garages in, it says public parking garages other than private garages. So you don't even go to 406.4 for anything on private garages. You stay in 3, which says they need a 1 hour fire barrier, as the architect said in his code analysis. And I'll leave it with that.
I do want to comment on a couple of things, rebut a couple of things. Bruce has brought up this footnote B of table 508.4. And the section that I asked him to repeat, he did say the required separation from areas used only for private or pleasure vehicles shall be reduced by 1 hour, but not to less than 1 hour. The subject of that sentence is the required separation. When there is no required separation, it cannot be reduced. That no other part of that footnote B is applicable. There are very easy ways to discuss how any other interpretation of that particular footnote would run us into all sorts of incongruencies. Earlier, Bruce mentioned that you wouldn't ever store a can of gas in your open private garage, but you may within the garages we're talking about. But these are actually condominium garages. I think the reason people are moving there so they don't have to store gas for their lawnmowers anymore. But let's just take that simple example. If the area is used only for private or pleasure vehicles, the reviewers believe that the separation requirement goes from 0 to 1 hour. Well, let's put our can of gas in there. Now it's no longer used for private or pleasure vehicles. Clearly, that can't be the intent of footnote B. Footnote B only applies to those separation requirements that are 2 hours or more. The perfect example would be a open parking garage adjacent to a sprinkled hospital. That normally would have a 2 hour separation. If that parking ramp is used only for private or pleasure vehicles, then that separation requirement can change from 2 hours to 1 hour. It does not do anything to an existing 1 hour separation, and it certainly does not affect in any way a separation or a area where no separation is required. Footnote B simply cannot create a separation where none exists. Thank you.
Thanks again, Tom and Bruce. I guess at this point in time, we open it up for discussion amongst the board. I do have maybe a quick question for you, Tom. You had mentioned on the opening protection, and we'll call it the garage door at this point in time. And you were suggesting that it's maybe not possible to get a garage door that has a fire protection rating commensurate to what is being requested because of the overhead clearances. Is that correct?
That is correct. Now, I hesitate to even raise that point because I don't want this Board of Appeals to think in any way that we feel that hardship should require any sort of a variance. We're not asking for a variance. The overhead clearance in level 2 of that garage is 7'4". A typical fire overhead fire door, the one that comes down automatically, it has fusible links, coils up, it rolls up, we've seen them before. Minimum 22 inches of clearance above open span. That would create a 5'6" maximum open span in a garage door.
We'll accept that.
Okay. As we open it up for discussion, are there other questions?
So on the on the architectural design drawings, they do reference. Can you bring that back up? The section 406
Which one?
on the architectural drawings on the code study.
Oh, yeah.
So just to clarify, they reference this section, the 406.3.1. Is that their intent? Is that they want to follow that section then?
Is how we read it. And this can be very confusing because Doug doing the plan review, he's got options. He could have just assumed that they're doing that. In that case, it would have gotten to an inspector who would have had to make a call out in the field at the last minute. That would have been a lot better. Doug did a good job bringing this up during the plan review, so we're glad it's done now as opposed to later. This disagreement here is, I think Mr. Smith agrees he could do the walls separating the units, but just kind of hanging them out there and not the openings out into the garage.
Tom, are there plans for these garages to be heated?
I'm sorry?
Are there plans for these garages to be heated?
No.
And maybe another clarification for you, Bruce, as far as it pertains to open parking garage design and overall area requirements. Obviously, you mentioned that being non-sprinklered and open, and it meets a certain criteria. You have to have certain percentages of openings on exterior walls, obviously open. By putting assumingly that this particular parking garage wasn't designed for private garages, likely based on the fact that there's limited height, does installing private garages take away the area that makes it an approved open parking garage? And then that being said, maybe these 8 garages don't, but if approved, there's the potential for other folks to maybe want to institute their own private garage, and we start taking away that floor area. Is there a point in time where it then doesn't meet the code requirements for an open parking garage?
Yeah, I think I alluded to it, Mr. Smith also did. The open parking garage requirements, we think back, and I always think, after 20 years, I'm to the end of the code. I mean, it's like getting to the end of the internet. Am I going to ever hear anything new? This is new. Tom and his architect are creative. They're doing something, and in our world, we want everybody to get everything they want, as long as it's safe in our eyes, within the code. So that issue came up, and the parking garage was constructed first. I don't know if Doug did the plan review on the first one. He went through the openness requirements at that time. And then, of course, this brought that issue back up. I think Doug went to the original designer. I don't know if they worked together to come to an issue, but that's why I started out with open parking garage and showing you an open parking garage. That's what it is. Nobody's put anything in there that wasn't accessory, such as a mechanical room, a stairway, or that kind of thing in an open parking garage before. I don't think Doug Thornburg's seen it before. So it's new, different. And the openness has to do with ventilation, air running through that building and providing smoke relief, mechanical, gas buildup, all kinds of other issues that is not in open parking or closed parking garages. So they're very different. The non-sprinklered, the sprinklered issue, we think about, we just can't get to not separating these. And I think Doug worked with the current project and the previous to come up with a compromise. We could see the plans, how they moved the garages in a little bit to here they're in a space off the outside wall, which is open. Another space and a space. So they held them off the outside wall. You know, how much you hold it off. The code isn't clear on that. The code isn't clear on if that creates a nuisance to the openness or not, because it's new. You're breaking ground here.
Could I provide a little additional information on that? The code really is quite clear on that. It's straightforward math. 20% is required to be open. In no way does the addition of our garages impinge on the 20% requirement. The floors from story to story, there are different floor to floor levels, and consequently there are slightly different open calculations for each of those. But in the most restrictive case, our garage partition walls, even if they were pushed all the way to the exterior of the building, completely eliminating any ventilation on that side of the building, that would reduce that opening from about 23% to about 21%. In the other openings, it's something like 26% to 24%. If you consider the most restrictive case where we didn't leave any opening, any throat, but actually pushed them all the way to the end. The code requires 20%. This plan was worked through with Mark Hanze, the original designer, on that very issue, the code compliance with section 406.5.7, openness in the ventilation system, or the openness of the ends of the parking garage. So the answer is no. The parking garages do not affect in any way the required openings set forth by the relevant sections.
Another disagreement, because we will say it will. And that's why I went to the extent. Sometimes you can look at things as a piece or a part or the whole. Okay, now push that to the outside wall. You're at the 20. Now fill the building with private garages. That's what he's asking you for today. Fill it. I don't know what the number is. What's the magic number? What are you going to allow or not? To have fires or something happen in an area where nobody knows about it. There's no sprinkler system. The ventilation rates, they must be removed if you're filling up with walls. I don't know how that works. It's new.
Doug poses a question Bruce poses a question to this board. How many will you allow? The code is clear. You will allow as many as are permitted until you reach the 20% threshold that no longer permits the garage to be considered open. At that point, additional ones could be allowed, but the open parking garage then becomes an enclosed parking garage and sprinklers are required. But there's nothing magical about this number. It's all just written there. It's part of the code. The ventilation system, the ventilation requirements of the S2 open parking garage are in no way adversely affected by the garages that we're placing in there.
Just a quick comment while this drawing is up, or question maybe, but garage A, I assume is protected on 3 sides and open to the outside, but that's an exterior garage, correct?
That is correct.
Which kind of fits in with the example Bruce had earlier, like private apartment building, individual garages divided into 1,000 square foot areas. You wouldn't typically run that barrier to the outside wall. Seems like in garages B, C, and D, you'd have no choice but to have that cover all the walls, fire barrier wise. So it seems to me that it comes down to the interpretation of table 508. I'm not sure if I'm simplifying that too much, but I mean, garages B, C, and D, and then on the other floors, those are spaces within another space. So I can't imagine that you could fireproof 3 of the walls and not the 4th wall, if it's required to be fireproofed. Does that make sense? The way I would interpret it. But so to me, it seems like it comes totally down to table 5.8. Is there any separation required, fire separation required?
Well, the reason we look at 406 is, well, first we have to, it's more specific, and it gets into the detail of all these garages. Public garages, open public parking garages, closed parking garages, private garages, and it's specific for each one. The section that says private garages shall be separated with 1 hour fire barriers, that's clear to us. It hasn't come up in a situation like this. In every other building it's been done, they've been able to run the fire barrier to the exterior wall.
Yeah.
So it works.
As I'm reading through that, it almost seems like that supersedes 508. Is that true or not?
Well, to us, they agree.
Okay.
Because the footnote says not less than 1, that says 1. So in our opinion, it agrees.
Bruce, can you talk about continuity just a little bit? You know, how do you interpret a fire barrier and continuity with a fire barrier? Because it seems like the big issue here is the issue that nobody's arguing the fact that there's fire barriers required between these units. The real issue is the fact that a fire barrier is extending out between the units, but there's no continuity. There's no, and you know, in theory, you could have a fire that starts on one side of that wall in the corner, and there's nothing to stop it from going around the corner and getting to the other side. So I think continuity is an important part of that discussion.
It is, in this case, now we have vehicles driving by. Of course, if I saw a fire, I wouldn't go in there. But, so continuity for fire barriers is under 707, I believe, if you like to read along. It says fire barriers shall extend from the top of the foundation or floor ceiling assembly below to the underside of the floor, roof, sheathing, slab, or deck, and be securely attached thereto. Such barriers shall be continuous through concealed spaces, such as above a ceiling joint or intersections, complying with 707, 8, and 9. Then we can't ignore openings. Openings in a fire barrier shall be protected. Reviewing requirements of maximum amount of openings in the wall. And so fire barriers have a little bit different requirement for vertical continuity than fire walls. Fire walls need to go to pretty much exterior skin. And then they have requirements even outside that skin. Fire barriers can just go to the outside wall. If it's a 1 hour wall, it should go to the skin. But they just don't hang out in the middle of nowhere. If it does, there's exterior wall requirements for that. This isn't an exterior wall, it's in the middle of a building.
I think that's probably the issue here, is that we're dealing with something that's even Doug from ICC hasn't seen before. It's a building within a building, basically. And it's not really a separated, just out of curiosity, was the parking garage reviewed initially, Doug, maybe you can answer this, as a separated or non-separated use?
There were no garage.
No, I'm talking about the parking garage building. When it was submitted by JLG, was it submitted for review as separated or non-separated uses?
There was no.
There weren't any other uses.
There was nothing to say.
It's just an open parking garage.
Yeah.
And it's separated horizontally from a separate building below, which is the, okay,
It,
Or still working on it.
okay,
and but the building itself was submitted all by itself.
right.
And we take them as they come. You know, if other things come, we review that as how it fits into that building. So, yeah, it was one use, open parking garage, right, when
Yeah.
it got submitted.
Okay.
It was
Excuse
up
me, but-
against a property line wall, so it did have to have a rated wall on the
Sure.
north end.
Okay.
In the submitted and approved plans from JLG Architects, government page 113, they cite section 406.5.3. This is the approved set. Mixed uses shall be allowed in the same building as an open parking garage, subject to an assortment of provisions, which includes 508.1. So I think, Brian, in answer to your question, mixed uses were approved in that building, the existing parking garage.
That is just a statement.
That's just a code analysis provided by the architect, and that happens all the time. But we're still gonna review the plans for how they are at the time. They can put all the code they want in there, but it's not approved, it's future, we're gonna review it when we get it.
Since we have some fire experts in the room, I'm curious if there was a fire, let's say in garage B, what is the procedure to try to put that fire out?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And Bruce really talked about this early on, the two classifications, your open parking garage or your enclosed parking garage. And in fact, just this last summer, we did have a car fire in an enclosed parking garage at the Roberts Common Ramp. And operationally, the way that kind of happens is, the building is protected, there's systems in place for ventilation, and then of course there's a standpipe. And so typically your sprinkler system contains the fire, crews would take hose up and use the standpipe to mop up any sort of leftover. So on an open parking garage, when you think about fire department operations, really the premise that we see on this is that the reason it's open is you have a requirement for the percentage of open spaces on the sides that we talked about that has to be at a minimum both sides of the building to allow heat and smoke and everything to escape. That allows our department to operate from a standpipe and a stairwell and pull hoses, and then we're fighting it essentially the same way we would in a parking lot. The only difficulty that comes in is you could be 5+ stories in the air, so you have that extra time to get up there. The concern that we would have when you start talking about this is you could create a condition now where you're enclosing certain stalls, and now that heat and smoke is allowed to build in a portion of a building that's not protected. And so this brings in a whole new kind of layers of consideration of operationally how do we handle this, because now you have connections that are exposed to heat that they might not have been to before. We have heat and smoke buildup in areas, so just operationally, it would not be the same way. I mean, the premise to me behind an open parking garage is that it's open so that whatever occurs is allowed to escape. And then you're essentially fighting a car in a parking lot that is elevated. And so this, we've said it several times, but this is very unique. I don't know of any other ones, and I reached out to a couple of jurisdictions to ask about, how do they handle this operationally? And I don't know that this exists. We haven't seen them anywhere else. And so we're going through some different paths of the codes here to figure out a way to use U garages, which are typically built standalone for a garage. And then we're also using open parking garage, and kind of we're blending some things and trying to find the path to that. But operationally, yes, it would be more difficult because we could have that potential of heat buildup and smoke buildup in those areas.
Okay, thank you.
I guess, the fire barrier question, I think, is really the crux of the issue here, because and to my knowledge, usually when you have a fire barrier, almost exclusively, I can't think of any other situation where I've had a fire barrier in a building where it hasn't terminated somewhere. And by definition, if the fire barrier is there to protect two structures, one that's a U to the other that's a U, and it's in between to protect those two, I think that because this is inside of another building, there's, the only person that can interpret the code is you, Bruce, and the people that work for you. We can't interpret the code as architects. We can give our opinion, and you can agree or disagree with us as the code official and make your determination. But we can't interpret the code, and in this case, because it is kind of unclear it kind of falls on you guys to provide direction. And I can certainly see the question of opening protectives and, you know, separation between garage units. If the purpose of that separation is to provide protection from one garage unit to the other, by extension, it has to be to provide protection from that garage unit to the garage that it's in. I know that that's saying something that the code doesn't directly say, but if your ultimate charge is protection of the public good and public welfare, and the code is saying that we need to protect these garages from each other, you can't protect these garages from each other even without having the openings protected that are directly adjacent to each other, directly adjacent to that fire barrier. I don't see how that would be an interpretation of the code that would make sense. So it seems to me that the code, even though it doesn't implicitly say 1 hour on all four sides of that garage, and it does say separated from the other private garages by 1 hour. But in a situation like this, that seems like it's clearly written for garages that are standing alone in an apartment complex that are in a row, and you have multiple garages that are outside, and you're containing that within each individual partition. Because you have other people that are parking, you know, within this enclosed structure and are driving right past it, you know, that seems like that continuity issue is a question that's pretty hard to get around. And you know, so I guess I'm still kind of going back to continuity and what does a fire barrier need to do related to continuity? And can a fire barrier just end without having it terminate at some point where either where it's protected on either side of that to a certain distance so that you can't have a fire just jump around a corner and keep going? I know that happens in firewalls all the time, where we have firewalls that terminate at an outside wall, and we have to protect horizontally along that exterior wall. Can't have an opening right next to a firewall in the outside wall unless it's protected. So you know, that is there a way that the doors could be repositioned, or you know, in some way we could find a way to protect the area on either side of that partition to a certain point, or do the openings just become, opening protectives really become the issue? Opening protectives and continuity of the fire barrier are the two biggest issues that I see.
So the continuity is an issue, and so the code has an allowance for designers to come up with any solution that they feel might work, and we would look at it. I believe we discussed one. So we never close the door on that. We want people to dream new things up, and something that it's got to be clear in our eyes that the intent of the code is being met. A little bit on the continuity thing, and Doug early on decided this was a room inside a building, because the way we look at buildings, anything with a roof is a building. Anything overhead is a building. Somebody builds a cantilever of 20 feet, even if it's grass underneath, we count that. They need the sprinkler below that area because there's a building up there. So as soon as there was a roof over it, considered it in the building, and the continuity had to get up to that next deck.
And I think the vertical continuity is, everybody understands that. I'm more just, horizontal continuity is the question that I would have. And, you know, is there a way to protect that horizontal continuity? You know, and really it comes down to an interpretation. By saying that you're protected from the other 1 hour garages by 1 hour, does that mean that you're protecting beyond the wall that's common to the two garages? That's really at the root of the question, as I see it. And I can see the argument, you know, from your side, and I can see, you know, a black and white view of the language that's in here that says private garages separated from the other private garages by 1 hour in that 406.3.1. The problem is this is an unprecedented thing so then the question becomes, is there an interpretation that needs to be made, which obviously there is, you know, to protect the common good and say that the opening protectives need to be protected to separate those garages from each other and from the other space. And then we're back to 508.1, or the exception to exception B there.
We believe that that when 508.4 is applied with its very specific requirements, that an interpretation is not required. Section 1 says that the specific requirements that are spelled out, that it is adjacent walls or common walls, be of fire barriers. That's a very specific requirement. 406.3.1 is more vague in it, that it says they must be separated by fire barriers. I guess we're talking about vertical assemblies in this case, fire barriers as per 707. So we're asking this board to look at the specifics of 508 and recognize that, for one, there is no separation requirement between U and S2 in any situation, regardless of how one might interpret footnote B to be applied, and that those specific requirements of 508 shall be applied over the more non-specific or general definition provided in 406.3.1.
I've got a question that's a little bit maybe different because of, you know, my experience and background. So is my understanding of it is the condos or the apartments or whatever they are, that's a separate building owned by separate individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And the parking garage is that the city of Fargo actually has some ownership of that, or is that but it's owned by a different entity? These are
I
two
think it's
different
a
buildings.
design-build deal where the city's gonna end up as the owner.
Okay, so what we have here is it's not any different than two buildings that are butted up right next to each other, different owners, like all the way downtown. Every building has a common wall. My question, I guess, and this is more the way my mind works, is the apartments or the living areas, is that sprinkled? That's required to be sprinkled?
It is sprinkling.
If these garages were connected to that sprinkler system, would they be required to be 1 hour rated?
We did discuss that issue. I don't believe the owner wanted to go in that direction.
We've explored that option. The garages are not intended to be heated, so we would need to have some sort of a dry leg or a dry head into that area. But the designer of the sprinkler system for the condominium units expressed to us that to provide sprinkler separation within the double T type construction, the floor of the garage is nice and smooth, but the bottom of the garage has these 30-inch projections that hang down, is very difficult, and any sort of a sprinkler system would require significant ancillary equipment. It has to be a dry system. We also don't read. I appreciate that question, but we have not sought that as a solution because we've not read anywhere in the code where we have a path with that solution. I don't know how the building officials would react to such a request.
So that's something that you've talked about internally, but you haven't made a determination of whether or not again, my area of expertise would be is that if a building is sprinkled, all of a sudden a lot of fire barriers, firewalls go away. I'm just trying to think of a way, because I understand the fire department and a fire in there, and if there was a sprinkler head in there, all of a sudden, that makes a huge difference in the significance of a potential fire being in there. So, I think that, and I appreciate what you're saying. I get it. I'm looking at I'm trying to look at a solution. Unfortunately,
Sure,
that's the way
thank
my
you.
mind works. Where you're saying, we can't do it with a door. If we can't do it with a door, is there another way to do it? And if that's the case, I hear what you're saying is look it says we don't need to have it, so, and we looked at it and we can't do it with a door, so that's the way, where my mind runs, so I guess that would be all I have to question about.
It's not clear to us how the building department would react to something like that.
And we usually react when we get it submitted. So we have something to review. And it usually comes from a designer that tells us how they're going to do it. And we know it's going to function before we do it. The issue came up, Doug talked to me about it at one point. And I mean, normally we have some general rules, like you don't just stop a sprinkler system. You can't just, there are some specific areas in the code that have some areas that you can sprinkle or not. This one isn't in there. We could look at it like that, but normally we would say, oh, if you sprinkle a little space, you're gonna provide a fire barrier anyway to separate a sprinklered area from a non-sprinklered area in a building. We always say that you need something to stop a sprinkler. In this case, we could look at it. IBC 104 allows us to look at any option as a compromise to some issue that might allow us to
you
see
look-
the intent of the code met.
Could you look at it as an alternative to 1 hour
Yeah.
construction? Because we do that all the time with window systems that have a deluge system, where you're basically eliminating the 1 hour requirement for the window so if you had a dry leg that went through there and basically protected that exterior wall where the openings are, you'd be protecting those openings with some sort of a system that is basically washing that opening.
Yeah, most wall wash is glass that we've seen. But maybe there's something. I never like to say no.
It doesn't seem that outside of a compromise that you guys would make, it doesn't seem like that maybe is the point at this juncture, because even the required separation still has that snippet. It doesn't talk about sprinkler or non-sprinkler. It just says N and then with a subnote. That's really where I think that's where we're stuck.
Yeah,
So
we're,
we could come up with
we're going by the
probably
code, and
Right.
so was Mr. Smith.
Yeah, we
and,
could go
and
by-
what's in there right now.
or come up maybe with some alternative solutions. Certainly in my head, I'm like Dave, and I start thinking through that. But I think ultimately what we're trying to decide here is if your interpretation meets is valid versus their opinion on what the code read. Tom, I got to commend you on your code research. As the three architects up here, we live in that book. So
I have two.
we've been, so we get it. Been there, done that. We've had intellectual wrestling with these guys at the same time, based on our opinion. And sometimes there is a compromise there, or there's something we didn't see in another section that they could direct us to. And then you guys, facilitate similarly in your environment. And I don't know if life safety, I couldn't recite any specific sections within the life safety that would steer us in a direction here. I certainly appreciate the fire department folks chiming in, because ultimately it's about keeping these buildings safe and keeping people safe and keeping our fire department safe. And it's kind of more sans the luxury of having a private garage in a structure. Obviously, there's some complications here because we've got two different owners, we've got connected buildings, we've got specific fire ratings, and then there's this one that it appears to have a little bit of gray area on the side of the city, maybe not so gray. And certainly, Tom, in your guys' opinion, would be that you're on the other side of that, thinking it's a little bit more black and white. So therein lies the difficulty that we gotta, as a board, come up with a decision: is to where we feel that this lies. But the question that I would have then is you are the building official, and as a building official and your deputies, your interpretation is the absolute.
It is until it comes in front of you. Then it's, do you agree with our interpretation?
Okay?
Or do you think we did not interpret correctly?
So based on if we went from agreeing that there should be continuity in that fire barrier on all sides, or if we see Tom's perspective that maybe there's a little bit of, it's a little bit more black and white because of the gray area that is in the code, then we have to apply that within Fargo's code
This-
requirements.
This case is specific, so
Okay.
you're gonna apply something to this project right now. That's what's been presented. So we threw a lot out there about other things and filled the thing with garages. That hasn't been, until that's submitted, we're not gonna even review it, but it's these 8 garages right now and whether they're separated.
And I guess the concern I have, Tom, is that the decision that we make here today, once it's made, every other parking garage in town that has any similar potential will now be viewed under the same decision that we make here. So while we're making a decision today for this specific project, we can't have somebody else come in 6 months from now and say, no, we're gonna change our mind now. I mean, once this is made, this becomes a precedent, and that is, it's more than just this as far as I'm concerned, as a board member. So, the decision we make here today has to be the right decision, I think.
Well, we've sought 2 specific reliefs. One is a determination on this footnote B issue of 508.4. And I'm hoping that this board can look at the words of that particular footnote and recognize that when no separation is required, footnote B can't create a separation because a certain restrictive clause, that being used only for private or pleasure vehicles, if we restrict some usage, it can't then create an additional separation. So one of the reliefs that we seek today is this board's determination on the merits of footnote B as it applies to areas that have no fire separation required in the first place. I mean, I could come up with 100 examples of how, if you interpret it, that it does, that storing of private or pleasure vehicles there does somehow create this separation requirement when none existed before. There's many examples of how you simply don't meet that requirement. For example, the mercantile parking garage does not meet that requirement. Interstate Parking operates that mercantile parking garage. At this point, they're doing it for Kilbourne. Later this month, the city will take over control. The city contracts with Interstate Parking. Interstate Parking does not specify in their long-term contracts or in their drive-up usage of that garage that the vehicles stored in there shall be private or pleasure vehicles. Each day in that garage are commercial vehicles. A particular local contractor regularly parks vehicles within that parking garage. That parking garage, the subject parking garage, does not meet the restrictive clause in footnote B, used only for private or pleasure vehicles. So there's just an example of how it is just nonsensical to try to apply an additional requirement to a situation when that situation meets a restrictive clause. All the situation would be to fail to meet that restrictive clause, as is in the case. So that's one thing that we've asked for, is a determination on what I certainly see as a very simple matter of the interpretation of footnote B of table 508.4. The other is to determine that we are meeting the fire separation, the horizontal assembly and fire barrier separations as specified in 406.3.1, as we are separating all of the common walls between these garage units. I understand that that's a challenging question, and that requires some interpretation. But I'm in hopes that the board will clearly be able to recognize that, that there is no separation requirement between a U and an S2 situation ever, regardless of whether or not it's used for exclusively for some certain type of vehicle or not. So two reliefs that we're seeking, and we're hoping that we'll be able to get some clarification on one or both of those matters. Thank you.
Let's just go with 508. I'm going to read the footnote B again from the commentary. The fires and rating of a space is used solely for private or pleasure views may be reduced by 1 hour, but never less than 1. Never less than 1. It's anticipating this. It didn't say it's 1, 2, 3, or anything. Never less than 1. It says it. It's clear. We interpreted that before we looked at this book.
Bruce, just.
He talked about types of vehicles used. There is prohibited uses of open parking garages. You listen, vehicle repair, bucks, trusses, similar vehicles, partial or complete, closing of openings, dispensing of fuel. This section reinforces the concepts and requirements of 40651 and the definition of open parking garages. Any other use or alteration of an open parking garage which is designed to take advantage of increased heights in areas is specifically prohibited. We're looking at that like that. It just goes over the edge. I mean, don't put the walls up, we're okay. You can keep any vehicles you want. You can allocate the spaces just like those other parking garages. You can do that. Now you're closing them up.
But specific to footnote B, the very first words are the required separation. And the predicate phrase in that sentence is shall be reduced. So you've got the subject, required separation, the verb shall be reduced. There is no.
And that's why your architect said non-separated uses. So we don't even need to go here. Non-separated. 40631 says 1 hour 5 hours. That's our case.
Board, the 1 hour separation is between the U type, the group U occupancies. The 1 hour separation is not between the U and the S2 occupancy, as clearly stated in 508.4, table 508.4.
I tell you what, as I look at this as an architect, and I'm always thinking max restrictions, because anytime you stumble upon an item that is more restrictive than something else, that's where we tend to go. We may argue that point, but we tend to go to max restriction. I see that as a max restriction. In my mind, as a designer, it seems that I'm not sure I can appreciate your argument, but I don't see the argument. I would have put, I think out loud that would be a 1 hour on all sides, because there's no way the continuity of that works. It just doesn't. You have to have it all the way around. We got to think about everybody else in this scenario. And if I were doing the code summary and the code study on that, I would have directly gone to that footnote and went, okay, I gotta do a 1 hour on all three sides. I don't see any other way out of it. I can appreciate your argument, but it's not holding water for me personally. I don't know how the rest of you guys are feeling about that.
I would agree. I don't think that there's enough there to overrule the interpretation from the building inspection department, in my mind. That drawing summarizes it for me when I compare garage A from garages B, C, and D. And we can talk about what is going to be stored there, but as soon as it becomes private, it could be anything. If you go through in the summer and you look at private garages on other apartment buildings and the doors are open, I can almost bet you that 2/3 of the units don't have cars in them. They're full of stuff. And I just think it's too a space within a space on B, C, and D are just too different than garage A, in my mind. I appreciate all your arguments, but I guess I personally, I would fall back on a common sense argument. As much as anything, with all the technical interpretations and disagreements, I'd still have to fall back on common sense.
If it pleases the board, I'd like to just raise one additional point. we've been talking a lot about fire barriers. Section 406.3.1 states that such private garages that we've designed shall be separated by 1 hour fire barriers in accordance with section 711 or 1 hour horizontal assemblies in accordance with section 711. We also believe that our group B, our group U private garages are separated by horizontal assemblies. In level 2, we do have a scenario where one of our, on level 2, that is slightly more than 1,000 square feet. If that area was reduced to 1,000 square feet, thank you, Bruce. If the area on level 2 was reduced to 1,000 square feet, we would have, by definition, exactly 3 Group U private garages, each not greater than 1,000 square feet. Each of those private garages would be separated from all other private garages by 1 hour horizontal assemblies in accordance with section 711. Now, this requires the exception that there is no group U to group S2 separation required, which 508.4 clearly states. If one accepts that there is no group U to group S2 1 hour any separation required, as is stated in table 508.4, then the horizontal assemblies, the floors of the parking garage, which as stated in the submitted plans, all concrete ramp structure, doors, floors, bearing walls, columns, beams, etc., shall be of 1 hour rated assemblies, even though not indicated. This is from the original plans of the parking garage. So we have 1 hour horizontal assemblies between all of the garages, between each of those 3 garages in that case, each 999 square feet, horizontal assembly between them. 406.3.1 says vertical fire barriers or horizontal assemblies, and section as produced as in accordance with section 711. 711 clearly spells out that the horizontal assemblies exhibited in that parking ramp meet all of the requirements. So we would argue that if one accepts that there is no separation as indicated in table 508.4 between group U and S2, then we apply and we reduce the size of level 2 garages to less than 1,000 square feet, giving us exactly 3 garages on each of 3 different stories within the open parking garage. Those group U assemblies are separated by 1 hour horizontal assemblies in accordance with section 711, the precise verbiage of section 406.3.1, the section that the reviewers have said that we failed to meet.
Sure, you remember the construction type? I believe it's 2A.
Well, I've been kind of silent here. I'm the reviewer. And there's one issue that Tom isn't bringing up. If you're separated horizontally by the deck, but I can drive from tier to tier to tier, how are you separated? There is no separation. I can't get there. I think the whole problem here, guys, it's quite simple. We need to separate 1,000 square foot chunks of your U garages from one another. That's it. And you have not accomplished that in plan review 1, 2 to 6. Okay? So that's why we're here, and thanks again here, board members. Your job is, this is not as simple as it looks. Fire, ICC, now here again, I'm gonna bring another thing up. ICC, in every document that you got from anybody and that I got, you know we make the call. They don't. They're an interpretation. So you can take it for what it's worth, but ultimately Bruce, myself, my colleagues, we determine what this means. And we work with everyone, by the way. So the question is, are these things separated? It's simple.
Doug, you directed that question to me. How are we going to separate them? You indicated that the Group U 1,000-foot garages must be separated from each other. You asked me, how are you going to separate them? I'm saying they are separated with horizontal assemblies per section 711. Section 711 specifies that the continuities of such assemblies shall be continuous without vertical openings except as permitted by this section and in section 712. And 712 goes over vertical openings in horizontal assemblies, 712.1.10.1. Automobile ramps. Vertical openings for automobile ramps in parking garages shall be permitted where constructed in accordance with sections 406.5, which is the section regarding the construction of open parking garages, and 406.6, which covers enclosed parking garages. So, to answer your question, the separation is achieved by the horizontal assembly of the floors of the parking garage. That horizontal assembly is continuous as required by section 711 with openings permitted by section 712. So it ticks all of those boxes. The only thing that we need to arrive there is the understanding that there is no separation requirement in the ensuing space. And table 508.4 clearly says between group U and group S2, there is no required separation. That's how you separate the three garages. And I acknowledge this is a slight modification to our submitted plans because this would require the reduction in size of one of our garages from about 1,150 square feet to 999 square feet, thereby eliminating one of our Group U occupancies on that floor. We would have 3 Group U occupancies on 3 different floors separated by horizontal assemblies.
I have a hard time understanding how, if we have an open side of a garage within a S2 open parking garage, from floor to floor to floor, if you have an open wall, how do you separate this tier from this tier? And what you just told me didn't explain any of that to me, by the way.
So is that question directed at me, Doug? Well-
Anyone that can answer the question, I guess.
406
Because it makes no sense. If I have tier 1 with 3 garages open to the S2, I go up the ramp to the next floor, and I have 3 more garages that are open. How are they separated?
Well, first of all, it's one Group U garage area on each of those 3 floors.
I'm calculating them all because they aren't separated in any fashion.
Indeed, it's one unit. It's one unseparated 999 square foot unit. Section 406.3.1 calls for separation of fire barriers or horizontal assemblies. These are separated by the horizontal assemblies as in accordance with section 711. Yes, you can drive your car from one to the other, but that automobile ramp is a permitted opening in the horizontal assembly. 712 permits that opening.
It does, but it doesn't permit you to open one garage to the other. It doesn't say that, Tom.
I'm sorry, when one garage to the other, which you're referring to?
One tier of garages, it does not say that you can, that opening that you created with the ramp, right? It doesn't say that you can calculate those numbers from this tier to this tier and exceed the 1,000. Does it say that anywhere, or am I missing something?
It says each garage unit shall be not more than 1,000 square feet.
Each.
Indeed, we have 3.
Chairman, are you hearing
999
anything
square
new?
Foot garage areas.
No.
Yeah, I guess it's,
I think what Tom's arguing is that if you had, say, 2,700 square feet of garages and you separated them into 3 chunks of 900 square feet, you wouldn't need any separation or any.
Indeed,
fire-
you have
fire
3
separation.
garages.
Separated them by distance. Like on a flat ground, let's say you had 2,700 square feet, divide them into 3 sections separated by 50 feet or something like that, would you need a fire barrier in that case? I think that's
Well,
what you're.
no, I'm saying that it's 3 garages separated, not by a fire barrier, but by a horizontal assembly as required.
He's saying he has separation this way, that's his intent.
Yep.
Doug's saying the building's still a spiral, there's no real wall separating going around the whole building.
Right.
He's saying he's separating this way, and I believe it's 1A or 2A. So it does have 1 hour, like Mr. Smith said, this way.
Yep.
So it's got it this way, big open hole on the end. That's
But the requirement of 406.3.1 is a fire barrier or.
I don't think you can use that argument though, Tom. You can't have, that's a very that or is a very specific or. The intent there is that they're separated from each other. So if you had a situation where you had multiple garages that were stacked, that would give you the situation where you have the horizontal assembly giving you separation. If they're together, you can't say, well, we're gonna provide a horizontal separation, but we're not gonna provide a vertical separation.
Understood. And let me be as clear as I can. It's 3 garages, 1 garage on each separate floor. The walls that would separate spaces within that group U, those do not constitute a separate private garage. The private garage can have, is 1 garage unit up to 1,000 square feet. So we're saying we've got 1 on the ground level, we've got 1 on 1 floor above ground, and 1 more garage up there, 3 units, to use the number 2,700 square feet or 2,999 square feet, not more than 1,000 on any given floor. The horizontal assembly separates those. There is no adjacent garages in the vertical assembly. They are divided in this image, but again, a private garage can be up to 1,000 square feet.
But they can't, if it's, I would agree with you if it was owned by one person, but because you have multiple tenants here and you have required separation between tenants, that required separation would extend to those garages and separate the garages within that large block of 3 garages. That's the way I would interpret it.
But there is one owner, the owner is the city, the tenants, there is not a required separation between those partition walls within that garage. I don't know where in the code, these are not demising walls between dwelling units. I don't know where in the code it would require that there be fire separation between the divisions in those garages. Bruce had raised examples of apartments where they're broken into 1,000 square foot chunks and separated. That's what we're talking about here, breaking them into 1,000 foot chunks and separating them. So that each one, actually I shouldn't say breaking them into 1,000 square foot chunks, limiting them to 1,000 square foot chunks, and then stacking them separated with horizontal assemblies in accordance with 711 and 712.
That's a good point. Let's say you could fly to your 2nd level garage. Would you allow 1,000 square foot garage to be put on top of 1,000 square foot garage with open holes? It's the same, it's similar. Nothing on the end walls. That garage starts on fire, it's going up. We know it's going up. We're going right up into that other garage. So this will protect everything outside if it's totally wrapped.
If I were to ask a clarification, if I look at the first floor plan, the one on the east side, garage D, there's an opening on that east side. So let's say we meet that horizontal assembly requirement between first and second floor, but the opening of garage D on first floor, let's just hypothetically say there's a car fire in there. That horizontal assembly does nothing to keep that fire from going vertical. That be appropriate?
Well, you've got unprotected opening separation requirements. Sorry, I didn't know we'd go into that section of the code. I don't have that memorized, but I think if you have 5 feet vertical between unprotected vertical openings in an exterior of a building, I think that meets it. I maybe could defer to the inspectors here, but the horizontal assembly protects it. The horizontal assembly not only is in between the adjacent structures, it extends for many, many feet on all sides of that of those assemblies.
That's a good point. I said this is 1A or 2A construction, 1 hour. It is not a fire barrier. Tom Smith said it's a fire barrier. It's not. It's 1 hour construction. You could put a hole right next to that garage. The owner could put a hole, he could take out a parking spot and put a hole right in that parking spot. Because it's not a fire barrier. It's 1 hour construction, and it's different than fire barriers. You guys know with fire barrier, when we start talking about opening protectives, joints, seal, holes, pipes, anything that goes through. That building can have holes anywhere it wants. Because it's 1 hour construction. It's not a 1 hour fire barrier. It'd be different if it was.
So if we're able to prove that it is, it states it in the plans. The pages in the design of the various assemblies includes a particular sort of caulking in between the joints and so on and so forth, achieving that 1 hour rating. That assembly meets, in my mind, and I believe provable, although Bruce, I must attest, not provable with the information I have in front of me, but provable that it meets Chapter 7, Section 711 requirements of a horizontal assembly. It's 1
For
hour.
construction.
I beg your pardon?
For construction. It needs to meet it for construction. It's really complicated. We're going to go in loops. Fire barriers are different than construction. There's 1 hour construction, there's 1 hour fire barriers. Mr. Salmon Structure will know if we say that's a fire barrier, we're going into all detail of all structure. You're not going to have open stairs like you can in an open parking garage. You're going to have fire barrier rated stairs now.
We do.
So we ignore things. So I would have to look at the plans to see if they said it's a fire barrier. Maybe it is. Maybe it's just separated this way. It still gets back to that point of, are the garages separated from the remainder of the building or not?
Yeah, and I don't see how you could not separate the garages from each other as well. I mean, if you stack 8 of these in a line, you're creating a condition where a fire can go between the garages, and how is a fire department supposed to get in there and put out that large of a fire within a certain amount of time too, in order to not go through 1 hour barriers in other areas and cause other issues. So I don't think you can ignore the 1 hour requirement between the garages. I just don't see that.
In apartment construction, as Doug was describing, isn't that precisely what happens? They're divided into 1,000 square foot areas. If you have, say, 5 200 square foot garages, they have fire barriers on the ends. They cap the ends of that, but in between, the 4 partition walls in between those other 5 in this example are not rated fire barriers. I may be mistaken. I've never built an apartment, but I think that that's a precise example that Bruce referred to at the beginning of this conversation.
The 1,000 does allow anything inside the 1,000. That's true, as long as they're separated by fire barriers in the 1,000. So if you had 5 200s, you could do 4 walls of plywood if you wanted, but it would be enclosed by 1 hour fire barriers.
So that's the scenario we're proposing.
But again.
Tom, there, you're missing one thing though. The scenario you just described is open to the sky. You are not open to the sky. That's your whole issue. And that's where we get back into the fire situations. We get back into all of what we've been talking about. If you had a 1,200 square feet of open garages in a typical apartment building, that's a string of garages on the side of the lot, you are correct. And that boils down to the fire barriers and Brian's comments about where does this fire barrier stop, right? If it's open to the sky, it's okay. If it's enclosed in a room or a space, it's not okay. That's my opinion.
But 406.3.1 permits it up to 1,000 square feet. I mean, it specifically permits it. Multiple private garages are permitted in a building. So I understand this is not open to the sky. I think that's why the 1 hour restriction or I'm sorry, the 1,000 square feet restriction comes in far smaller than any other higher risk restriction.
Yeah, you're still not gonna get me from the story to story separation. I can't grasp my mind if I have a wall open on floor 1, and I can drive 16 feet over and go to the next floor, and I have 3 more garages that are open. They are not separated by Webster's dictionary as far as separation,
Well, they
in
are
my
by
opinion.
section
They are not
74.
separated.
Seems like the private garages and a public open parking garage is an anomaly here that hasn't necessarily been accounted for by the code. I mean, we've talked ourselves in circles here for quite a while, and in the absence of a clear direction that says you really can or can't do this, we have to rely on our building officials to provide interpretation, because it's not black and white. I would disagree that it's black and white. I think it is a very gray issue. I mean, we deal with this all the time. You mentioned, Mike, the life safety code earlier. You can point out 20 very clear instances where the life safety code tells you one thing and the IBC tells you something else. And at the end of the day, it comes down to the building official to make the determination of what we follow. And Dave, I think your point about setting precedent is a great point. I'd love to see this discussed at the ICC level. I mean, we just said that Doug, you said that he'd never seen anything like this before. And it's clearly maybe a gap in the intent of the code, but I can't imagine that the writers of the code intended that you'd be able to put a private garage where you have zero control into a public garage where you have complete control over what people are putting in there without having some protection to the general public. And so, I guess I would fall down on the side of what the city is saying, but I think you need to take a look at other alternatives, for how you could achieve some opening protectives at those openings, whether that's through a sprinkler system or through some other sort of door opening. I think the charge that we give these guys to protect the public is a huge responsibility. And we have a phenomenal code department in Fargo. I mean, I commend everybody for the amount of time that you put into this, because it's not a simple issue. It's not a just black and white issue. If it was, we would go to 508.4 and it would clearly say, that U and S2, generally, when you look at that column there, the only non or N for no separation requirement that's in that category is between F2, S2, and U. And if you go all the way down the line in every other single category, there's a separation requirement. So that tells me that either it's never been done, or there's a specific reason why they wouldn't have said, okay, putting a private garage inside of a public garage could happen someday. I don't think that they anticipated that with that statement. And so, the required separation, I would fall back on the code commentary just like Bruce is doing, and say, if in the absence of clear direction, if they're saying never less than 1 hour, that's where I would end up, in the discussion. And I know, Tom, it's probably not what you want to hear, but the responsibility that these guys have to interpret the code, without a clear black and white interpretation that we can take from the pages in here, we have no choice but to allow them to do their job to interpret the code. And as soon as we take away that ability, we really tie their hands. So, I guess any other comments that you guys would have, I'd be interested in hearing them. But that's kind of, at the end of the day here, I think it's not a black and white issue. It's a gray issue. And if we're, as members of the Board of Appeals, if it's our responsibility to come down on this one side or another of an issue, related to the interpretation of the code unless it's black and white, and we can point to clear direction in the book that says, this is what the book says, and we don't think you're interpreting it correctly, then siding with the opinion of the code office is really the only option that we have, I think.
Yeah, I agree, Brian. I think if it's not black and white for us to be able to go against the code official, then we can't go against the code official's decision then, so. At this time, can we make a motion, Bruce, or
Yes, was that a motion and a second?
I'll make a motion to deny the appeal.
I'll second.
So motion is approved to deny the appeal.
And I just a little bit of point of discussion. I think that it's really incumbent on the code office to work with the appellate and try to come up with an alternative method that doesn't put undue hardship on them so that they can continue on with their project. I think it's a great project, and the use of private garages in a public parking garage like this is certainly something that the code needs to clarify, obviously, because we've just spent 2.5 hours almost talking about it. So, I think there's definitely room for clarification here, but in the absence of that clarification, I think it really is important that the code office work with the appellate to try and find a solution that can allow them to continue on with the private garages within the public structure here.
Thank you, Board, and we can do that. We do offer that. The apartments or condos are separated by a firewall. So if the doors were installed in the openings, the permit for the apartments could continue. I was trying to think of something. The only thing I can think of right now is you do have allocated garage spaces. Those could be still allocated if the garages weren't constructed. The appellant could have more time to work with the designer and come up with a solution. Contrary.
I got one other question, Bruce. This isn't related to the fire, but how are these, with the parking ramp, you have maintenance on a parking ramp. Now that you have some private garages inside a parking ramp, how is that maintenance going to be done when it comes to the joints and the precast? How is drainage even work in these garages? As the snow melts off a vehicle, where is that water going to go? And just nothing you have to make an answer for right now. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I assume, and Tom Smith alluded to the agreement, and there's a many-page agreement to even have those allowed to be in here. And I think he's mentioned too that it did stipulate he couldn't do anything in the park that was contrary to the previous code analysis. And it even mentions require sprinklers in the garage because that came up early on. And they haven't done anything yet. If we could permit the condos, and if no construction was done in the home parking garage, they could still use the space. If any other system or design came up, we could look at it when it wants to actually have walls.
Can I request one point of clarification? My appeal was based on 2 different sections of the code. Am I to understand that you are rejecting both the 508.4 interpretation and the 406.3.1? I guess I would respectfully ask that we look at those two situations separately to see if as we work forward to try to arrive at a solution, having some clarification on those separately would be of benefit.
May I interrupt for a moment? There's another meeting starting in 15 minutes.
Okay. Hey, Gretchen, just to back the train up a notch, do we need to formally vote on the motion?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
okay. And maybe also to clarify for Tom, I believe we're brought here to make a motion on behalf of the appellant or on behalf of the code official of the city. Are we charged with clarifying or making a motion for both of Tom's questions?
You
as far
can-
as the code?
You can motion, the floor is yours right now on a motion. That's why I offered one, and mine's simple, it's to agree with our opinion on the fire barriers enclosed. You can add things to it if you'd like, word it however you want, it's gonna go on the record, whichever way it goes.
But as appellant, I've requested two separate matters to be addressed. And I'm not making any suppositions about how such a separate vote would go, but I think it's reasonable to afford me the clarification on both of those issues, not just on an umbrella issue or an umbrella statement.
Would you like to do a roll call on each section?
Sure. Let's again, maybe back the train up a notch here and just make sure, can you clarify for us?
We've sought two reliefs. One was the clarification that in table 508.4, no separation is required between group U and group S2 occupancies as indicated by that table. The other was to seeking the relief that you would agree that our separations present or in the plans did meet the requirements of 406.3.1.
I don't, in my opinion, I guess I don't think we'd have to separate it out. It's all together as one issue, and we're just saying we agree with the building official that we can't accept this appeal.
Okay.
I think that maybe gets us a little bit in the weeds. And I'm not sure, Tom, if that is gonna afford you what you're gonna wanna hear, in the like anyways. I think, we were brought here to either agree with your opinion on the code or the city's interpretation of the code. I think we're just going, personally, I think we should, stick to that particular agenda rather than backing the train up and going into specifics.
Very well. Thank you.
You-
Thank you for that
You could
consideration.
make it as simple as denying the appeal if you wished.
So the motion on the table was to deny the appeal.
Correct.
Can I get a vote for denying this appeal? Do I have to make a motion for that, Gretchen, or do I just, yep, so making a motion to take a vote on denying the appeal. All in favor, say aye.
I,
Aye. So motion has been approved to deny the appeal.
Was it 5? Call for
Roll
nays.
call.
I didn't hear any nays.
Okay.
Is that correct?
Correct. Dave?
Aye.
Justin?
I,
Brian?
Aye.
Kevin?
Aye.
Mike is an aye.
Thank you.
And I can appreciate, Tom, 100% where you're coming from. I don't think this is an end-all. I think you just have to go back to the drawing board and maybe work with the city on something to that level, but we're gonna put our eggs in the basket of the city on this particular scenario, because it seems more clear to us that you just can't build walls in an enclosure and another enclosure. It doesn't seem relevant at this particular point in time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Board.
Moving forward, as we've got another meeting coming up, are there any announcements?
I was going to mention a couple things. We will be starting the code meetings this fall. And we've had a little issue getting the code books. I think they still have some on back order. I think the ICC is COVID backed things up and doing things on pre-order, and we're pre-ordering and not getting them all. So I'm hoping that doesn't get delayed, but we'll get you. Did the board all get their books?
They have not. I'm waiting for full sets before I distribute.
We
That way
ordered
you'll
full
get them.
sets. Ordered full sets. We didn't even get the full set, so we're trying to wait till we get everything, and then you'll get it. And then the other issue was the quorum thing came up from the city attorney. We're going to look into that, and we'll bring it up at the next meeting we have. And we may need to adjust how our quorum is listed in the bylaws. I think the state law may have changed.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. At this point in time, I'd like to have a motion to adjourn the meeting.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
So motion approved to adjourn the meeting. And appreciate everybody coming out. And that was an excellent discussion.